The Grimm came at Beacon from 3 directions simultaneously, which was the specific tactical configuration of an assault that had been organized rather than instinctive. The coordination that larger Grimm species sometimes achieved when a Nevermore or a Goliath was directing the smaller ones. The hive behavior that Huntsmen had learned to watch for because it was the difference between a manageable incursion and something that required evacuation protocols. This was the evacuation protocol situation. RWBY had been fighting for 47 minutes, and the wave was not thinning. She moved through the assault's eastern edge in the specific way she moved when she was running on trained instinct rather than tactical calculation. Speed semblance pushing her through the Grimm lines at velocities that turned her into a weapon of trajectory rather than a weapon of contact. Crescent rows extending through the arcs that the movement created, the combat becoming a physics problem that she solved continuously and without deliberation. To her left, Yang's gauntlets were doing what Yang's gauntlets did, which was converting every impact she received into the next impact she delivered, the golden light of her semblance beginning to appear at her fists in the specific indication that she had been hit enough times to have stored something significant. Weiss was coordinating the glyphs that had been managing the civilian evacuation corridor for 30 minutes, her face carrying the particular expression of concentration that looked like calm and was actually the opposite. Blake was where Blake was when the fighting got worst, which was everywhere that needed her and nowhere that anyone could definitively confirm she was. They were holding. They would not hold much longer. "Wave count," Cyclops said, in RWBY's comm, the senior huntsman who had been coordinating Beacon's defense since the first contact alarm. His voice had the quality of a professional managing a calculation he didn't like the result of. "Eastern edge, 40+, RWBY said. Beringles at the tree line. They're pushing the smaller ones ahead as shields. Western perimeter is the same, Cyclops said. They're converging on the plaza." "What's at the plaza?" RWBY said. "The civilians who didn't make the first evacuation," Cyclops said. RWBY's semblance activated without her deciding it had. She was at the plaza's western entrance in the fraction of a second that her semblance required to cover 400 meters. The rose petal trail of her movement already dissipating when she arrived. The Grimm were 40 meters out, a wall of Beowulfs and Ursa Major moving with the coordinated pressure of an assault that had been directed rather than driven, their red eyes carrying the specific intensity of creatures that had been pointed at something and had been told to continue. Yang arrived 30 seconds later, at which was the specific timeline of someone who had been running rather than semblance traveling and who had been running very fast. "This is bad," Yang said. "I know," RWBY said. "Like, bad, Yang said. "I know," RWBY said. The Grimm line stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated. Stopped. The complete cessation of movement across every creature simultaneously. 40+ Grimm freezing in the specific posture of bodies that had been in motion and had received an instruction to not be in motion anymore. The red eyes, which had been fixed on the plaza's civilian position, moved, not toward RWBY and Yang. Away from them, toward the tree line, the direction from which the Grimm had come, the direction of whatever had produced the instruction. The shadows stretched. This was the specific detail that Yang would describe afterward as the thing that told her something was different. Not the Grimm stopping, not the silence that replaced 40+ creatures' worth of combat noise, but the shadows. The evening light of Beacon's campus was producing the normal shadows of trees and buildings and people, but the normal shadows had been joined by something else, something that moved against the light rather than with it, something that was expanding from the tree line toward the plaza in the specific way of a tide coming in. Deliberate and continuous, covering the ground between the Grimm line and RWBY's position with a darkness that didn't correspond to anything blocking the light. The fallen Grimm at the plaza's edge, 3 Beowulfs and an Ursa that RWBY had killed in the first minutes of the fight, and their dissolving bodies still partially present, stopped dissolving. The shadows covered them. They stood up. Not the standing up of creatures revived. The standing up of creatures that had been given new architecture, their forms rebuilt from the darkness that covered them into something that was their shape and was also shadow. Their eyes no longer red, but the deep purple of something that had been remade rather than restored. Yang raised her gauntlets. "Ruby," she said. "I see it," Ruby said. "Are those—" "Shadow Grimm," Ruby said, because naming the thing was the first step toward having a response to it, and she needed a response immediately. The Shadow Grimm did not move toward them. They moved to the sides, forming a line, a perimeter, between the plaza's civilian position and the still frozen Grimm beyond them. "They're protecting the civilians," Yang said, with the flat quality of someone whose threat assessment had just been required to perform a significant revision. "Yes," Ruby said. She turned toward the tree line. He was already there. The specific quality of Sung Jin-Woo's arrival was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things were usually dramatic. Not the entrance of someone performing significance. Not the presentation of someone who had decided their presence should be announced. He stepped from the tree line's shadow into the campus light with the particular ease of someone for whom darkness was a medium rather than a barrier. And the step was just a step, unhurried. Not the specific movement of someone who was aware that the situation required his attention and who was giving it his attention without any of the urgency that the situation would have produced in anyone else present. He was wearing black. He looked at the frozen Grimm line. He looked at the Shadow Grimm he had raised, arrayed between the civilians and the threat. He looked at Ruby and Yang with the evaluating attention of someone who was performing a rapid assessment of individuals he had no prior information about. "Are the civilians clear?" he said. Ruby stared at him. "The people behind you," he said, with the patient specificity of someone who had asked a question and was clarifying it rather than repeating it. "Are they in a position to evacuate?" "Yes," Ruby said. "The corridor is open." "Then they should use it," he said. "Who are you?" Yang said. "Someone who arrived at an inconvenient time," he said. "The Grimm line will hold for approximately 4 minutes before the behavioral suppression wears off. I'd recommend using those 4 minutes for the evacuation." Yang looked at Ruby. Ruby looked at the frozen Grimm. At the shadow soldiers arrayed between the civilians and those Grimm. At the man in black who had arrived from the tree line and whose first question had been about the civilians. "Get them out," she said to Yang. "You sure?" Yang said. "He protected them first," Ruby said. "I want to know why." The misunderstanding lasted 6 minutes, which was shorter than most misunderstandings involving someone who could raise the dead lasted. Primarily because the person being misunderstood was Sung Jin-Woo, and misunderstandings had a specific relationship with Jin-Woo's capabilities that resolved them quickly. Weiss arrived first. She had finished managing the evacuation corridor's final civilians and had followed the shadow soldiers. The specifically wrong detail of shadow soldiers in a world that didn't have shadow soldiers. The immediate threat assessment of someone whose analytical training fired before her tactical one, and had arrived at the plaza in time to see Jin-Woo standing in the center of it, and to draw the conclusion that Weiss Schnee drew when she encountered an unknown individual commanding creatures of darkness in the vicinity of Beacon Academy. She drew a dust glyph. It was a very good glyph. Weiss's glyphs were always very good. This one was a summoning glyph layered with a binding component, designed to contain an entity of significant power and hold it long enough for higher authority to make a determination about its classification as a threat. Jin-Woo looked at the glyph the way he looked at most things, which was with the complete attention of someone who was processing what he was seeing and making a determination about the appropriate response. He stepped aside. The glyph activated where he'd been standing and produced its binding effect on empty air. "Your dust-based abilities use spatial anchoring," he said to Weiss, with the tone of an observation rather than a provocation. "The anchoring assumes the target's position is fixed. If the position changes between the activation trigger and the effect's manifestation, it misses," Weiss said, and with the specific expression of someone who had just had their technique analyzed out loud in a combat situation and was deciding how to feel about it. "Yes, I know. It's a good technique," he said, "against most opponents. But not you," Weiss said. "No," he said. Blake arrived from the building's shadow. The specific arrival of someone who had been present longer than anyone else knew, who had been reading the situation from a position of observation before committing to a position of action. She was not in a fighting stance. She was standing with the specific, careful attention of someone who had sensed something that her combat training didn't have a category for and was trying to find the right category. "There's something following you," she said. Jin-Woo looked at her, and the look was longer than his previous looks. Not startled, but the specific extended attention of someone who had been asked the question they had been hoping not to be asked. "Yes," he said. "What is it?" Blake said. "I don't know," he said. This was, Ruby noted from her position 3 meters away, the first thing he had said that carried any weight in it. The previous statements had been delivered with the flat efficiency of someone reporting information, but this one had the specific quality of admission, the particular weight of an unknown that the person it belonged to found significant. "You don't know," Weiss said, with the tone she used when an answer was insufficient. "I've encountered things I couldn't identify before," Jin-Woo said. "Usually they became identifiable when I fought them." He paused. "This one hasn't." Yang had returned from the evacuation perimeter and was standing at the plaza's edge, taking in the situation with the relaxed alertness of someone who had fought enough things to have developed a comprehensive threat assessment capability and was currently applying it. "You raised those Grimm as shadow soldiers," she said. "I did," he said. "That's normally—" Yang started. "Salem's domain," Ruby said. Jin-Woo looked at her. "In this world," Ruby said, "the only person who controls Grimm is our greatest enemy. The Queen of the Grimm. She's been trying to destroy humanity for centuries." She paused. "When you did what you did, every person at Beacon thought you were her or hers." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" Weiss said. "Because the appropriate response to being mistaken for humanity's greatest threat is to establish that I'm not," he said, "which requires time and observation rather than explanation. Explanations from unknown sources are inherently insufficient." He looked at Weiss with the specific attention of someone who respected the argument they were disagreeing with. "You were right to be suspicious. I would have been." Weiss blinked. It was the specific blink of someone who had prepared for an argument and had been given acknowledgement instead, and who was recalibrating. "The shadow soldiers," Ruby said. "The ones you raised from the Grimm. They're not behaving the way your soldiers usually behave, are they?" Jin-Woo looked at her with the look he had given Blake. The longer look of someone being asked the question they hadn't wanted answered. "No," he said. "How are they usually supposed to behave?" Ruby said. "Under complete command," he said. "My will is their directive. They have no independent impulse." He looked at the shadow soldiers at the plaza's perimeter, still arrayed in their protective formation, still facing outward toward the direction the Grimm advance had come from. "These ones have been maintaining that formation since I raised them. I haven't directed them to." "You didn't tell them to protect the civilians," Ruby said. "No," he said. "They did it anyway," Ruby said. "Yes," he said. Ruby looked at the shadow soldiers, at the dark forms that had been Grimm and were now something else, on a raid between the place where civilians had been and the direction that danger had come from. "Your world's darkness," she said slowly. "In this world, darkness comes from negative emotion, fear, grief, anger. The Grimm are born from those things. They're attracted to them." She looked at Jin-Woo. "When you crossed into this world, what did you bring with you?" Jin-Woo was quiet for a moment. The behavioral suppression on the frozen Grimm line was wearing off, the creatures beginning to stir at the edges, the 4-minute window he had specified approaching its end. "We need to finish this engagement before that conversation," he said. "Agreed," Ruby said. "But we're having the conversation." "Yes," he said. "Can you work with us?" she said. He looked at Team RWB, at the 4 of them, and the specific combination of capabilities and personalities that the situation had assembled at the plaza, the people who had been fighting for 47 minutes before he arrived and who were visibly exhausted and who were still standing. "What's your approach?" he said. Ruby almost smiled. It was the specific, almost smile of someone whose read of a person had been confirmed. "East flank," she said. "Yang takes the pressure off the bearingles at the tree line. Blake handles the Ursa Major. They're coordinating the smaller ones. Weiss maintains a suppression grid on the northern approach. You and I clear the center." "And the shadow soldiers?" he said. "Keep them on the civilian corridor until it's clear," Ruby said. "After that, your call." He looked at her for 1 second. "All right," he said. And they went to work. The 6 minutes of misunderstanding ended not with a resolution, but with a shared objective, which was sometimes the same thing and was in this case sufficient. The Grimm line, as it turned out, was not prepared for what fighting alongside Jin-Woo meant, which was fighting alongside someone who did not have a ceiling in the conventional sense, and who directed his power with the specific economy of someone who had been doing this for long enough to have optimized the process past the point of visible effort. The engagement lasted 11 more minutes. When it ended, Beacon's Plaza was clear. The shadow soldiers dissolved, not the dissolution of defeat, the deliberate release of Jin-Woo returning them to the shadow. The 3 that had been maintaining the civilian corridor formation dissolved last, and in the moment of their dissolution, Ruby had the specific impression of something that shouldn't have been possible. The shadow soldiers had been facing outward toward the threat's direction the entire time. Not because Jin-Woo had told them to, because in a world born from negative emotion, something in the darkness he had brought with him had decided that was the direction to face. She held that. She held it alongside the question she had asked. "What did you bring with you?" And the weight she had heard in the pause before his answer. "Sung Jin-Woo," she said, when the silence of aftermath had settled. He looked at her. "The conversation," she said. He sat down on the plaza's steps with the specific movement of someone who had decided the conversation was necessary and was committing to it. Ruby sat beside him. "Start from the beginning," she said. The beginning, as Jin-Woo told it, was the kind of beginning that required the listener to revise their understanding of what a beginning meant. Not the beginning of his story. He did not tell them that. Not in full. Not in the plaza, with Beacon still settling from the assault, and the shadow of whatever had followed him through the rift present at the edge of his awareness like a sound pitched too low to hear, but felt in the chest. He told them the relevant beginning. The part that explained why he was here and what he was carrying and what it might mean for the world he had arrived in. Ruby listened the way she listened when something mattered. Completely, with the focused attention that she usually applied to combat, and that she had learned, sometime in the last 2 years, to apply to people as well. Weiss listened analytically, building a model from each new piece of information, her expression the expression of someone whose model was being continuously revised and who found the revision process professionally uncomfortable. Blake listened from slightly further away, her attention divided between Jin-Woo's words and the things she had been sensing since his arrival. The presence that followed him, the darkness adjacent to his darkness that was not his. Yang listened by watching his hands. She had developed this habit without being entirely conscious of it. The idea that people's hands told you things their faces were trained to conceal. Jin-Woo's hands were still. The specific stillness of someone who had learned absolute physical control as a survival mechanism, and who maintained it even when the content of what they were saying was not entirely controlled. His hands were still, and his voice was level, and his eyes were doing something that was not quite distance and not quite presence, but was the specific quality of someone who was here and somewhere else simultaneously. The monarchs, he said. The war. The world he had come from. He described it without drama. The specific narrative style of someone for whom the events described had been processed enough to be recounted without the acute weight of recent experience, but not processed enough to be recounted without weight entirely. There was a particular moment where Ruby heard something in his voice that she couldn't name and that she filed away for later, when she had more context for it. After the war, he said, the world was different. The gates stopped opening. The monsters stopped coming. The people who had been fighting for years were suddenly living in the years they'd been fighting toward. He paused. Some of them found that easier than others. And you? Ruby said. He looked at her with the look he had been giving her when she asked the questions he hadn't wanted asked. The longer look. The one that meant the question had landed somewhere real. I found it quiet, he said. Blake understood this. She didn't say so. She sat with it in the way she sat with things she recognized in other people. The specific recognition of someone who had spent years living at a threat level that made peace feel like a misdiagnosis. The Shadow Monarch's power, he continued, was never designed for peace. It's built around death, around the dead, around the space between what lives and what doesn't. He looked at his hands. The only time during the conversation that he looked at his hands, a gesture that Ruby noticed and that struck her as involuntary. When the world became peaceful, the power began, reaching, looking for the equivalent of what it had been managing, something that fed the same fundamental energy. Negative emotion, Weiss said. Not in my world, he said. In my world, the gates opened because of a different mechanism entirely. The monarchs, the rulers, their conflict was the source. When the conflict ended, the source ended. He paused. But the power doesn't distinguish between sources. It only recognizes the energy. And somewhere, through the dimensional boundary, it found this world. Remnant, Ruby said. A world where the darkness has been continuous for longer than any individual has been alive to remember, he said. Where the negative emotion is generational, accumulated. Where the monsters born from fear have been feeding a cycle of fear producing more monsters for centuries. He looked at Beacon's tree line, at the direction the Grimm had come from. From my world, it was like a signal. Clear, strong, directional. The power pulled toward it the way, he searched for the accurate description, the way a compass needle moves toward a pole it was built for. And you followed it, Yang said. The rift opened, he said. I went through it. A pause. Something followed me. The plaza was quiet. What followed you is not your shadow soldiers, Blake said. Not a question. A statement made with the specific certainty of someone who had been reading the present since his arrival and had built enough of a picture to be certain. No, he said. It's something else, Blake said. Something that's using the same register, the same frequency. But it doesn't feel like yours. Jin-Woo looked at her with the specific attention he gave to accurate observations from unexpected sources. When I came through the rift, he said, something came through with me. Not a shadow soldier, not anything I summoned or intended to bring. Something that was adjacent to the rift energy. That used the crossing as an opportunity. He paused. I've been sensing it since arrival. I can't read it. You can't read it, Weiss said, with the tone of someone identifying the specific significance of a detail. I can read everything else, he said, simply. Not arrogantly, as a statement of operational fact, the way a navigator states a known position. Every Grimm in my sensory range, every shadow soldier, every dimensional signature that my power can reach. This thing, he stopped. It's in the same category and it doesn't respond to the same rules. Show me what you mean, Ruby said. He looked at her. Not about the thing you can't read, she said. The things you can. Show me what your sensory range actually covers. He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed his eyes. The shadows at the plaza's edge moved. Not dramatically. Not the theatrical extension of a power performing for an audience. The shadows shifted with the specific economy of a sensory system doing what sensory systems did, or extending his awareness outward through the medium that carried it. Ruby watched the shadows and tried to read what she was seeing, which was the attempt to interpret a language she hadn't been given the grammar for. 23 Grimm at the tree line, he said, eyes still closed. 14 Beowulfs, 6 Ursa, 2 Beringles, 1 Nevermore circling above the northern perimeter. 3 human heat signatures in the building's eastern wing. 1 injured. The injury is in the upper left arm. The presence, he opened his eyes, is northwest. Approximately 4 kilometers. Moving. Ruby looked northwest. That's the old road that leads to Mountain Glen, she said. There's nothing at 4 kilometers on that road, Weiss said. Nothing that should be there. Something is, Jin-Woo said. Blake had been looking northwest since he started his sensory sweep, and what she saw, or more accurately, what she felt, the faunus sensitivity to darkness and concealment that her years with the White Fang had developed, and her years as a huntress had refined, was consistent with what he was describing. Something at 4 kilometers on the Mountain Glen Road. Something that was using the same cover his presence provided, the same darkness, the way a second shadow used the same light as the first. We need to brief Ozpin, Ruby said. Yes, Jin-Woo said. He's not going to... Weiss started. I know, Ruby said. He's going to have questions. He's going to want containment options, Weiss said. If Jin-Woo's presence is attracting Grimm at the scale we just saw. My presence attracts Grimm, Jin-Woo confirmed, without apparent distress at the fact. The Shadow Monarch's energy is, to Grimm, what a light source is to moths. The Grimm that attacked today were larger than typical incursions. Significantly, Ruby said. Then the attraction effect has already been active since my arrival, he said. Which means Beacon has been experiencing elevated Grimm activity for, he calculated, approximately 6 hours. We've been fighting for 6 hours, Yang said, with the tone of someone identifying a connection they wished they hadn't. I am the reason, he said. The statement was direct and carried none of the guilt that the statement's content would have carried from most people, which was the specific quality of someone who had moved past guilt about factual realities and was at the stage of managing consequences. Ruby recognized the quality, and she had seen it in Ozpin, in the specific way Ozpin discussed the Long War, not without cost, but with the particular discipline of someone who had decided that cost accounting was only useful, insofar as it informed action. Then we manage it, she said. Jin-Woo looked at her. You're not, he started. Upset? Ruby said. About the Grimm? I'm upset about the Grimm. I'm upset every time there are Grimm. She met his eyes with the directness that was her most consistent quality, the specific inability to be indirect that had been both her greatest asset and her most consistent social challenge. But being upset about the cause doesn't help the people dealing with the effect. Managing the cause does. She paused. You can help us manage it. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I can. Salem received her first intelligence report at the 3-hour mark. Cinder delivered it in person because the nature of the information was the kind that Salem's agents had learned, through the specific education of consequences, was not transmitted through proxies. Information of this significance required a direct report, and direct reports required physical presence, and physical presence in Salem's castle required the specific combination of usefulness and nerve that Cinderfall had been cultivating since her recruitment. A new power in Beacon, Cinder said. Not a semblance. Not anything our intelligence has classified before. She produced the Observer's report, the field agent embedded in Vale's network who had watched the plaza engagement from the building's roof and had documented what he'd seen with the professional accuracy that Salem required of her agents. He raised fallen Grimm as shadow soldiers. Salem read the report with the focused attention she gave to information that she had not anticipated receiving. She read it twice. Immortal, she said. The Observer's report indicates no visible aura depletion, Cinder said. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. He fought without defensive aura use. No injuries. She paused. The Observer believes he could have ended the engagement significantly faster than he did. He was managing the team's integration, Salem said, with the specific certainty of someone who had been reading combat reports for centuries and who knew the specific signature of a combatant who was fighting at a fraction of their ceiling to accommodate partners. He slowed himself to match their pace. Yes, Cinder said. Salem set the report down. She looked at the window, at the Grimm-infested territory beyond it, the landscape of a world that had been hers in the sense of being managed by her, shaped by her, populated by the creatures that her grief and her millennia had produced. She had been alone with this world for longer than any human civilization could meaningfully comprehend. She had outlasted everything that had opposed her. She had watched Ozpin's cycle repeat itself enough times that the repetition had become a kind of conversation she was having with herself. Something new had arrived. Something that commanded the dead. Something that had arrived from outside the world and that had no allegiance to any faction, any cycle, any of the histories that had shaped Remnant's current configuration. His objective, she said. Unknown, Cinder said. The field agent believes he arrived unintentionally. No one arrives from outside a dimensional boundary unintentionally, Salem said. The mechanism that creates such crossings responds to something. Either he was drawn here or he was sent. She looked at the report again. Shadow soldiers that protected civilians without command instruction. She paused. Something in his power responded to this world's darkness before he arrived. Is that possible? Cinder said. This world has been producing darkness at scale for centuries, Salem said. If his power is built around death and the dead, Remnant is the single most death-saturated environment in any world that has ever produced it. She picked up the report and held it for a moment. He would have felt this world like a call. And he answered it, Cinder said. He answered it, Salem confirmed. The question is why a being of that capability answered a call from a world that has nothing to offer him. She set the report down. Find out what he is, she said. Not what his power does. What he is, what he came from, what he lost. She looked at Cinder with the specific attention of someone who had been studying human motivation for longer than human civilization had been recording it. A being that powerful who arrived in this world alone. Something drove him out of his own. Find that thing. And then, Cinder said. And then I'll know how to speak to him, Salem said. At the 4-kilometer point on the Mountain Glen Road, in the shadow of a collapsed overpass that had been abandoned since the city's fall, the thing that had followed Jin-Woo through the rift was feeding. Not on shadow soldiers, not yet. What it was feeding on was the ambient energy that Jin-Woo's presence produced in Remnant. The specific interaction between his Shadow Monarch power and the world's negative emotion. The chemical reaction of two darkness sources encountering each other and producing something that was more than either alone. Jin-Woo's crossing had not simply added the Shadow Monarch's energy to Remnant's. It had catalyzed something, the way a catalyst worked in a chemical reaction, in not providing the energy of the reaction, but changing the rate and the product of it. The thing under the overpass had been a Grimm. It was not a Grimm anymore. It had been an alpha Beowulf, old, large, the specific age and size that produced the behavioral complexity that made old Grimm more dangerous than young ones. It had been feeding on the rift's ambient energy since Jin-Woo's arrival, absorbing the specific frequency that his Shadow Monarch power produced. And the absorption had produced something that the Grimm's biological architecture had not been designed for and had responded to by adapting. The mask had changed. Not cracked, changed. The bone-white plate that covered its face extending into new geometry, growing down its spine in the specific pattern of creatures that were incorporating new material into their structure. Its shadow was wrong. Not the shadow of an animal, not the shadow of a Grimm, but the shadow of something that was becoming a different category of thing, a shadow that stretched in directions that the available light didn't explain. It was aware of Jin-Woo. This was the detail that would not have been possible for a Grimm of its original type. Grimm did not have the cognitive architecture for the specific awareness it was currently experiencing, the ability to sense a power source at distance and to understand the relationship between that power source and its own development. Grimm felt. They were attracted. They moved toward negative emotion with the primal pull of the thing they had been made from. This thing was not moving toward emotion. It was tracking a power signature. It had been tracking it since the crossing. It turned its changed face toward Beacon. The amber light in its eyes, which had been the standard Grimm red when it was a standard Grimm, had shifted, not to the purple of Jin-Woo's shadow soldiers, to something between those colors, the specific hue of something that was in the process of becoming and had not yet become. It would eat more. There was more to eat. The Shadow Monarch had brought so much with him. Blake found Jin-Woo at the perimeter 3 hours after the briefing with Ozpin, not looking for him specifically, following the thing she had been sensing since his arrival, which had moved from its northwest position toward the campus perimeter over the last 2 hours. Or the slow approach of something that was interested but not yet committed. She had been tracking it with the specific patience of someone who had learned that the most dangerous things were the ones that moved slowly enough that you could convince yourself they weren't moving. Jin-Woo was already at the perimeter. He had felt it coming, his sensory range covering the approach with the continuous awareness of a power that didn't require deliberate attention to function. He was standing at the tree line's edge, looking northwest, and the shadows around him were doing the specific thing they did when he was alert but not active, organized, present, the ready state of a power that was monitoring rather than deployed. Blake stopped 3 meters from him. "You've been tracking it too," he said, without turning. "Since you arrived," she said. He turned then, the deliberate turn of someone choosing to engage a conversation rather than continue monitoring. "You sensed it before I identified it as separate from my own presence. You're used to your darkness," Blake said. "You've been in it long enough that you recognize it as you. Anything that's not you would feel like nothing to you, like the absence of a signal." She paused. "I'm not used to your darkness. To me, everything about you is a signal I'm reading for the first time, including the thing that isn't you." He looked at her with a look, the longer one. "You've lived adjacent to darkness before," he said. "Not this kind, but adjacent." "Yes," she said. "Then you know what it costs," he said. Blake was quiet for a moment. "I know what it costs to try to stop living adjacent to it," she said. "The adjacency is easier, for a while. It feels like you understand something that other people don't. Like the darkness is a language, and knowing it means you're more prepared than the people who don't." She looked at the tree line. "And then you realize that knowing the language doesn't mean it's speaking for you." Jin-Woo was quiet for the specific duration of someone sitting with a statement that had arrived accurately. "The thing that followed me," he said. "It's been feeding on the interaction between my power and this world's negative emotion. The two darkness sources are producing something between them, something it can consume and grow from." He looked northwest. "I've been trying to understand its nature, what it is. Whether it's something that came through the rift as something specific, or whether it became something specific by being in this world." "Does the distinction matter?" Blake said. "For what can stop it, yes," he said. "If it came through as something I have a reference for, I have approaches. If it became something new in this world, I'm working from first principles." "And," Blake said, "it's becoming," he said. "It's using this world to become something that doesn't have a direct equivalent in mine." He paused. "Something that can eat my shadows." Blake looked at him. "If it can eat your shadows," she said, "then the more you use your power, the more it grows," he said. "Yes. Then you need to not use your power," Blake said. "I need to stop it before it grows too much to stop," he said, "which requires using my power, which accelerates its growth." He looked at his hands. The same involuntary gesture Ruby had noticed. The specific tell of someone whose relationship with their capability was complicated in ways they had not fully mapped. "I've been in situations where the tool I needed to solve a problem was also the thing making the problem worse." "What did you do?" Blake said. He looked at the tree line. "I found a way to solve it that cost something," he said. "What did it cost?" Blake said. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Blake had begun to think the conversation had concluded. "People I couldn't protect," he said, "because I was in a position where protecting them required using what was making the problem worse." Blake sat with this. At the tree line's edge, a Grimm moved through the shadows, small, young, on the specific darting movement of a creature navigating toward the campus's negative emotion. It crossed through Jin-Woo's sensory range and froze. It did not attack. It stood at the tree line, frozen in the specific posture of a creature that had encountered something its behavioral architecture had not prepared it for. Not a huntsman, not a weapon, not a threat. something that registered as darkness and therefore not prey. The specific confusion of a predator encountering something it couldn't categorize as food or threat. Then it fled. Jin-Woo watched it go. Even the Grimm run from you, Blake said. They run from what they sense I contain, he said. The dead I carry with me. The ones I've made into soldiers. He paused. In this world, the dead are supposed to dissolve. The Grimm dissolve and become nothing. My soldiers don't dissolve. They stay, carried in the shadow, available. And whatever this world's darkness is, it recognizes something wrong about that. Not wrong, Blake said. Just different. Grief and the way we hold on to what we've lost. That's what makes Grimm. You're carrying your losses in a way that Remnant's darkness has never seen before. She looked at him. That's what's attracting them. Not your power. Your grief. Jin-Woo was still. Not the active stillness of someone managing a response. The specific stillness of someone who had been given a frame for something they had understood as a tactical problem and were encountering it for the first time as something else. Blake did not push. She had said what she sensed, and she had said it accurately, and the rest was his to sit with. The thing at the overpass is moving again, she said after a moment. Yes, he said. Slowly. Is it afraid? She said. No, he said. Then it's ready, she said. He looked northwest. Not yet, he said. But it will be. And in the shadows of the mountain glen road, the thing that had been a Grimm continued its slow transformation, eating the ambient energy between two worlds' darknesses, becoming the specific thing that the collision of Jin-Woo's grief and Remnant's fear could produce when given enough time and enough fuel. Its amber-purple eyes turned toward Beacon. It had a name now. Names arrived with consciousness, and consciousness arrived with complexity, and complexity arrived with feeding. The Abyss Sovereign was not yet what it would become, but it was beginning to know what it was. And knowing what it was meant, knowing what it needed more, the Shadow Soldiers started disappearing on the third day. Not in combat, not the deliberate dissolution of Jin-Woo releasing them back to Shadow, not the damage threshold dissolution of a soldier that had taken more than its architecture could manage. Simply gone. Jin-Woo would reach for a specific soldier in his sensory awareness and find the space where it had been empty, not absent in the way of something that had never been there, but absent in the way of something that had been removed, the specific negative space of a presence that existed until it didn't. He noticed the first disappearance 6 hours after his conversation with Blake. By the third day, he had lost 11. He told RWBY on the morning of the fourth day, in the specific way he told people things, directly, without preamble, with the information organized in the order that was most useful for the person receiving it, rather than the order that was most comfortable for the person delivering it. 11 soldiers, RWBY said, in 3 days. Yes, the thing at the overpass. It's feeding on them specifically now, he said. Before, it was consuming ambient energy, the interaction between my power and Remnant's emotional atmosphere. Now it's targeting the soldiers directly. More efficient source. RWBY looked at the training ground where she had asked him to demonstrate his Shadow Army's capacity. 6 soldiers standing at the perimeter in the early morning light, the specific dark forms of his power in a world that hadn't been built to contain it. She had been watching them for 2 days, the way she watched things she needed to understand. What she had understood was that the soldiers were not simply weapons. They had the specific quality of things that had been people, the residual characteristics of the individuals they had been pulled from, movement patterns, fighting styles, the muscle memory of a previous existence, informing the behavior of a current one. Can you recall the ones that are missing? She said. No, he said. They're gone. Whatever the Abyss Sovereign... He used the name Blake had given the thing at the overpass, which had attached itself to the phenomenon with the specific inevitability of accurate naming. Takes, doesn't return. It's destroying them, RWBY said. Absorbing them, he said. The distinction matters. Destruction would remove the energy. Absorption retains it. adds it to its own architecture. He paused. It's been a Grimm, a shadow soldier, and now something between. It's collecting categories. Getting stronger from each one, RWBY said. Yes. Then we can't let it keep feeding, RWBY said. Every soldier it absorbs is another step toward something we can't address. Yes, he said. We have to find it, RWBY said. Before it's ready. It's already moving, he said. It has been since this morning. The approach is slow, it's still cautious, but the direction is consistent. He looked toward the city. Vale. RWBY looked at him. At the specific expression he was wearing. Not the flat professional assessment she had first encountered in the plaza, but something underneath that. Something that the 3 days of watching Beacon's Grimm activity spike and then spike again and then spike again while he remained present had produced in him. Not guilt. She had noticed that he didn't carry guilt in the conventional sense, or if he did, he had processed it into something less visible. Something more like the specific weight of a person who had been in the position of being the cause of collateral damage often enough to have developed a functional relationship with it, and who found that the functional relationship was less comfortable than it looked. You're thinking about leaving, she said. He looked at her. If you leave, she started. The Grimm activity normalizes, he said. The attraction effect dissipates. Beacon's incursion rate returns to its standard escalation rather than the accelerated rate my presence is producing. He paused. But the Abyss Sovereign has been feeding for 3 days. It won't stop because I've left. It will continue feeding on what's already in this world, and it will grow. And if you stay, RWBY said. The Grimm activity continues elevated, he said, and the Abyss Sovereign grows faster. There's no good option, RWBY said. No, he said. There's the option where it grows fast and the option where it grows slow. Neither option includes it not growing. Unless we stop it, RWBY said. He looked at her with a look that meant she had said something he had already arrived at and that he was deciding how to respond to. We don't know what stops it yet, he said. No, RWBY said. But 3 days ago we didn't know it existed. We learn. She looked at the 6 shadow soldiers at the perimeter. Can I ask you something? Yes, he said. The soldiers you've lost, she said. Were they people in your world? A pause. Yes, he said. Enemies? People you fought? Mostly, he said. Some were allies I lost in the war. A few were people who mattered. RWBY held this. At the shadow soldiers at the perimeter, at the dark forms that had been people, that still carried the residual patterns of the people they had been, that Jin-Woo held in his shadow and carried with him wherever he went. The Abyss Sovereign is taking them, she said. Yes, he said. And you can't get them back, she said. No, he said. She understood then what the weight was. Not guilt about Beacon's elevated Grimm activity, not concern about the tactical situation, though the tactical concern was real and present. The specific weight of someone who had been carrying the people they had lost inside them, carrying them in the most literal sense available, as shadow soldiers, as the continuing presence of beings whose physical existence had ended, and was now watching something reach into that carrying and take them again, losing them twice. Jin-Woo, she said. He looked at her. I'm sorry, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't know what to say. The quiet of someone who had been given something they hadn't been given before and were taking a moment to understand what it was. Thank you, he said. It was the most direct thing he had said in 4 days. Salem sent Cinder on the 4th day. Not as an agent, Cinder was too visible, too known to Beacon's huntresses, for intelligence work. As an intermediary. The specific deployment of someone who existed at the intersection of Salem's world and Beacon's, whose relationship with both sides made her the most appropriate vessel for a message that Salem had spent 3 days composing. The message was not a threat. This was the thing that made it dangerous. Salem had considered threats. She understood threats, had been deploying them for centuries, had calibrated the specific weight and timing of threats against Ozpin's cycle, with the precision of someone who had run the same experiment enough times to have mapped every variable. Threats produced predictable responses. Ozpin mobilized. The huntresses trained harder. The cycle continued. A being who had arrived from outside the cycle was not subject to its variables. The message Salem sent with Cinder was not a threat. It was recognition. Cinder found Jin-Woo at the training ground's edge at the second hour of afternoon, which was where the field intelligence had indicated he would be. Blake had noted in her report to Ozpin that Jin-Woo maintained a specific position at the training ground's perimeter during the hours when the Grimm activity was lowest. The specific habit of someone who was using available quiet to maintain awareness rather than rest. "Your Cinderfall," Jin-Woo said, without turning. Cinder stopped. "You've been briefed on Vale's factions," she said. "Ozpin briefed me on the major players," he said. "Your specific energy signature matches the description of someone with a Fall Maiden's power." He turned. "Which means you're not here on your own behalf." Cinder held the look of someone who had prepared for several versions of this encounter and was updating to the version that had actually occurred. "Salem would like to speak with you," she said. "I know," he said. "You know," Cinder said. "She received intelligence about my arrival immediately," he said. "She's been 3 days composing a response that wasn't a threat, because she understood immediately that threats aren't the appropriate mechanism for a being she doesn't have leverage over." He looked at Cinder with the flat assessment of someone reading a situation completely. She wants to offer something. Alliance, resources, information. Something that frames the conversation as mutual benefit rather than recruitment. Cinder was quiet for a moment. "You're correct," she said. "Tell her I'll consider it," he said. "After I understand the Abyss Sovereign's current development stage. After I know what stopping it requires. If what stopping it requires includes resources she can provide." He paused. "I'm not ideologically opposed to unusual alliances." "And your current alliance with Beacon," Cinder said, "is also an unusual alliance," he said. "I arrived as a perceived threat and spent 6 minutes being attacked by people who are now providing me intelligence and access to their training facilities." He looked at her steadily. "I don't choose alliances based on existing factions. I choose them based on shared objectives. Salem's objectives and Ozpin's are not shared," Cinder said. "No," he said, "but if the Abyss Sovereign threatens both of them, they might temporarily be." He turned back to the perimeter. "Tell her I'll consider it." Cinder left. Jin-Woo looked at the space where she had been. "You heard all of that," he said, eyes to the shadow at the perimeter's edge. Blake stepped out of it. "Yes," she said. "Your thoughts?" he said. "Salem has been manipulating powerful beings for centuries," Blake said. "She's very good at finding what they want and appearing to offer it." "I know," he said. "But she's also been managing the Grimm for centuries, and whatever the Abyss Sovereign becomes, it's going to be a problem for her operation as much as for Beacon's." "She'll betray you," Blake said. "Probably," he said. "But not until after she's gotten what she wants from the Alliance, and what she wants is help against the Abyss Sovereign, which is something I also want." He paused. "I'll know when she's preparing to betray. I can read the pre-betrayal energy signature in people. It's not fundamentally different from preparing a combat move." Blake looked at him. "You've been betrayed before?" "Yes," he said. "Recently?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not recently," he said. "A long time ago, before I was what I am now." Another pause. "Before I was what I am now, betrayal was something that happened to me. Now?" He stopped. "Now you see it coming," Blake said. "Now it can't reach me," he said. And the flatness of his voice on those 4 words was the specific flatness of someone stating a fact that they found neither comforting nor triumphant. Blake sat with that. The Abyss Sovereign arrived at Beacon's perimeter at the first hour of darkness on the 5th day. Not charging, not the Grimm charge that Jin-Woo's sensory range had been monitoring for 5 days, the mass assault that the elevated Grimm activity had been building toward. Walking. The specific deliberate approach of something that had decided it was ready and was choosing to communicate that readiness through the manner of its approach. Jin-Woo felt it the moment it crossed his sensory range. It was larger than it had been at the overpass. The 3 disappearing shadow soldiers were visible in its energy signature. Not their forms, not their individual characteristics, but the specific frequency of his power absorbed into something else, changed but recognizable, the way a voice remained recognizable after being filtered through different architecture. He was at the perimeter in the time it took the alarm to begin. Team RWBY was 30 seconds behind him. The Abyss Sovereign stopped at the tree line's edge. It was the height of a large barrangle, but its structure had departed from Grimm biology in specific ways. The white mask extended down its spine in the pattern Blake had described from her earlier tracking. The shadow-wrong shadow it cast, moving in ways that physics didn't generate. The amber-purple eyes carrying the specific light of something that had accumulated enough to have developed a relationship with itself. Ruby raised crescent rose. "Hold," Jin-Woo said. "It's here," Yang said, with the specific tension of someone whose semblance was running hot from the anticipation of 5 days of elevated Grimm activity. "It's at the perimeter." "Hold," Jin-Woo said again. The Abyss Sovereign looked at him. Not at Team RWB, not at Beacon. At Jin-Woo specifically, the directed attention of something that had spent 5 days tracking a power signature and had now arrived at its source. "You are not from this world," it said. The voice was wrong in the way of something that had learned to produce sound by absorbing the capacity from things that already had it. Not a voice in the conventional sense, but a frequency that resolved into language. Blake's grip on Gamble's shroud tightened at the sound of it. "No," Jin-Woo said. "Your shadows have fed me," the Abyss Sovereign said. "Your grief has shaped me. Your crossing made me possible." It looked at him with the amber-purple eyes that had been Grimm red 5 days ago. "I am what happens when 2 worlds' darknesses meet." "And what do you want?" Jin-Woo said. "More," it said. It moved, not at Jin-Woo. At the shadow soldiers Jin-Woo had arrayed at the perimeter, the fastest path to the resource it had been consuming. It crossed the 40 meters between the tree line and the nearest soldier in the time that something of its size should not have been able to cross 40 meters. Yang moved faster. The impact of Ember Celica at full charge hitting the Abyss Sovereign was the specific impact of a force that had been building for 5 days of elevated threat activity finally finding its output. The golden light of Yang's semblance at full activation, meeting something that her semblance had never met before. Something that absorbed impact differently than anything in Remnant's bestiary. The Abyss Sovereign staggered. It did not fall. "Its aura structure," Weiss said, and already running the analysis that her combat training made automatic. "It's not like a Grimm, it's layered. The outer layer is shadow energy, Jin-Woo's. The inner layer is Grimm biology. They're reinforcing each other." "You need to hit the inner layer," Jin-Woo said. He was already moving, not toward the Abyss Sovereign, toward the flank, the tactical repositioning of someone who was managing a multi-party engagement rather than a solo one. But the shadow energy absorbs physical impact before it reaches the Grimm layer. "How do we get through the shadow energy?" Weiss said. "Dust," Blake said, from the perimeter's far edge where she had repositioned without anyone tracking the movement. "Shadow energy and dust interact. I've been reading the interaction since day 1. The shadow energy can't absorb dust the way it absorbs physical force." "The polarity is different," Weiss confirmed. "Dust operates on a fundamental energy frequency that isn't compatible with shadow absorption." She was already preparing a dust glyph. A layered composition, ice and lightning. The combination that her training identified as highest penetration against layered defense structures. "But the window for the inner layer is small," Jin-Woo said. "The Grimm layer heals. I know what Grimm healing rates look like. We have 2 seconds of window after the shadow layer is disrupted." 2 seconds, Ruby said, and her semblance was already active. The rose-petal trail of her movement beginning at the perimeter's edge as she read the engagement's geometry and found the line that the 2-second window would require. "I'll call the window," Jin-Woo said. "When I call it, we go," Ruby said. "Together." He looked at her. the specific look of someone who had been fighting alone for long enough that together required a moment of adjustment. "Together," he said. The engagement that followed was the specific kind of engagement that happened when people who had been forced into operational proximity for 5 days discovered that the proximity had produced something more useful than familiarity. It had produced the beginning of trust, the specific functional trust of combatants who had watched each other work long enough to have built models of how the other made decisions. Weiss's dust glyph hit the Abyss Sovereign's outer layer at the precise angle that Jin-Woo's sensory range had identified as its lowest shadow energy density. The specific information advantage of someone who could read an opponent's internal structure from the outside. The shadow layer disrupted at the impact point, the dust frequency interfering with the shadow absorption in the way Blake had predicted. "Now," Jin-Woo said. RWBY moved. Silver eyes activated at close range. The involuntary activation of a power that responded to darkness with the specific response it had been designed for. The silver light hitting the Abyss Sovereign's exposed Grimm layer at the exact moment that the 2-second window opened. The Abyss Sovereign screamed. Not the grim scream of a creature in pain, the frequency-wrong sound of something that had been accumulating and had encountered a force that was oriented specifically against what it had accumulated. The Grimm layer underneath the shadow absorption convulsed. The healing rate Yang had disrupted, and Weiss had penetrated, and RWBY's silver eyes had hit, all contributing to a cascade that the Abyss Sovereign had not yet developed sufficient depth to absorb. It retreated. Fast. The specific fast of something that had decided that the engagement's terms were no longer favorable, moving back toward the tree line with the urgency of a tactical withdrawal rather than a rout. Jin-Woo was at the perimeter's edge watching it go. "It learned," he said. "From one engagement?" Yang said. "It's been learning from everything it's consumed," he said. 5 days of shadow soldiers. Every soldier carried the combat experience of the person I raised it from." He watched the tree line where the Abyss Sovereign had vanished. "It has the experience of everyone I've lost. It knows how I fight." The perimeter was quiet for a moment, with the specific quiet of a skirmish that had ended without resolution. Contact made, neither side destroyed, the engagement having served primarily to clarify the nature of the problem. "It's going to come back stronger," RWBY said. "Yes," Jin-Woo said. "And next time it won't retreat," RWBY said. "No," Jin-Woo said. "Next time it will have decided it's ready." RWBY looked at Beacon, at the campus behind them, the people in it, or the Huntsmen and students and staff who had been managing elevated Grimm activity for 5 days and who had no frame for what was currently developing at their tree line. Then she made a decision. "We need Salem," she said. The silence that followed was the specific silence of Team RWBY processing a sentence that violated every operational framework they had been trained in. "RWBY," Weiss said. "The Abyss Sovereign is growing from both worlds' darknesses," RWBY said. "It has Jin-Woo's shadow energy and Remnant's Grimm biology. To stop it, we need someone who understands Grimm biology at a level that goes beyond Huntress training." She looked at the tree line. "And the only person in this world who understands Grimm biology at that level is the person who created them. Salem will use this," Weiss said. "Oh, whatever cooperation she offers, she'll betray us," RWBY said. "Yes, Jin-Woo already knows that." She looked at him. "You said you'd consider her alliance if the Abyss Sovereign threatened both sides. Does this qualify?" Jin-Woo looked at the tree line. "Yes," he said. "Then we reach out," RWBY said. "On our terms, with Ozpin's knowledge, eyes open. Ozpin will not—" Weiss started. "Ozpin will hate it and agree that it's necessary," RWBY said, "because Ozpin has been making necessary decisions he hates for longer than any of us have been alive." She looked at her team. "This is not a good option. It's the only option we have that doesn't involve waiting for the Abyss Sovereign to decide it's ready." Yang looked at Jin-Woo. "You trust her read on this?" Jin-Woo was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. Yang looked at RWBY. "All right," Yang said. "But I want it on the record that this is a terrible idea." "Noted," RWBY said. Blake was already composing the message in her head. the specific language that would reach Salem through Cinder's channel in a way that communicated terms without appearing to negotiate, that established the contact on their initiative rather than Salem's, that said, "We are coming to you because we have chosen to, rather than because we had no other option." She wrote it down. In the tree line 400 meters north, in the darkness that the Abyss Sovereign had retreated into, the amber-purple eyes watched Beacon's perimeter. It had learned something from the engagement, not about their tactics, about their silver eyes. The Grimm layer it carried remembered the silver light the way old Grimm remembered Huntsmen, as information, as warning, as a thing to account for the next time. The shadow layer it carried processed the frequency that Weiss's dust had disrupted and found the counter-frequency in the experience it had absorbed from Jin-Woo's lost soldiers. It was not ready, but readiness was a matter of time, and it had consumed enough to understand that time was the one resource that always favored the thing that kept growing. Salem received Ruby's message at the second hour of morning. She read it 3 times. Not because it was long, it wasn't. Ruby had a gift for compression that Salem's century-trained eye recognized as something that developed in people who had learned the hard way that excess words were excess vulnerability. She read it 3 times because the message's structure was doing something that Salem had not expected from a girl of Ruby's age and experience, which was that it was not asking for anything. It was offering a trade, not a negotiation, a trade. Clean, specific, stripped of the diplomatic framing that Ozpin's faction typically used when approaching Salem, the framing that was designed to make cooperation sound reasonable, and that Salem had learned to decode as desperation wearing a tailored coat. This message had no coat. It said, "We have a problem that threatens both our operations. We have a capability you need. You have information we need. Bring your Grimm intelligence and bring yourself, and we will fight together until the Abyss Sovereign is addressed. And then we will return to our respective positions without pretending that a tactical alliance constitutes a philosophical one." The last line was, "We know you'll betray us when the time serves you. We're doing this anyway." Salem looked at that line for a long time. "The silver-eyed girl wrote this," she said. "Yes," Cinder confirmed. "She's either extraordinarily naive or extraordinarily confident," Salem said. "She's been fighting beside the Shadow Monarch for 5 days," Cinder said. "My assessment is the latter." Salem set the message down. She looked at the window, at the Grimm-infested territory, at the landscape that had been hers in the sense of managed rather than owned. The long work of centuries expressing itself in the creatures that moved through the darkness with the specific directional quality of things that had been shaped by will rather than evolution. Her Grimm, her darkness, her world's fundamental negative emotion, distilled and given form and pointed at the cycle that had been repeating since she had decided the cycle would repeat. The Abyss Sovereign was not her Grimm. She had felt it the moment it began its differentiation, the specific disturbance in the Grimm network that connected her to the creatures of her making, the sensation of a node in the network that was no longer hers but was using the network's frequencies, growing, absorbing, and becoming something that existed in the Grimm architecture without being subject to her authority over it. A Grimm that didn't answer to her was not a Grimm. It was a competitor. "Prepare for travel," she said. "Personal guard only. No Grimm escort. They'll cause exactly the kind of signal disruption that would compromise the tactical situation." Cinder looked at her. "You're going yourself." "The message specified my presence," Salem said. "It also specified information I would bring personally." She picked up the message and held it for a moment. "The Shadow Monarch's power is built around death, around the dead and the carrying of them." She set it down. "I have been carrying something for longer than most civilizations have existed. I understand what that weight produces in a person." She paused. "He will listen to someone who understands it. The silver-eyed girl knows that." "She's using you," Cinder said. "Yes," Salem said. "Competently. That's more interesting than being used incompetently." She moved toward the door. "Come." The meeting happened in the open. This was Ruby's specific insistence, not in Beacon's conference rooms, Not in any enclosed space where the dynamics of territory could complicate the dynamics of conversation. In the training ground, in the morning light, with Beacon's campus visible behind them and the tree line where the Abyss Sovereign had retreated visible in front of them. Everything visible. No table to sit across. No architectural framing to create hierarchy. Salem arrived with 3 guards and Cinder. RWBY had told Ozpin, who had insisted on being present, which was the specific insistence of someone who had been managing Salem for longer than the architecture of the current beacon had been standing and who was not willing to let the management pass entirely to a 17-year-old, however capable the 17-year-old was demonstrating herself to be. Ozpin, through Oscar's body, stood at RWBY's right. Weiss was at her left. Blake and Yang were positioned at the training ground's edge. Not aggressively, not in fighting stances, but positioned in the specific way of people who wanted Salem to understand that the distance between observation and engagement was short. Jin-Woo stood in the center. Salem's eyes went to him the moment she cleared the training ground's entrance. She stopped walking for a brief moment. The specific stop of someone encountering something that their extensive experience had not prepared them for, that recalibrated their assessment of the situation before they continued. She had read the intelligence reports. She had composed a response based on them. She had understood, intellectually, what a being who had won a war against entities that her own considerable power would have difficulty classifying was. The intellectual understanding and the sensory experience of his presence were not the same thing. She continued walking. They met at the training ground center and looked at each other with the mutual assessment of 2 entities who existed at power levels that most beings in any world didn't reach. Shadow Monarch, Salem said. Salem, Jin-Woo said. You know my name, she said. I've been briefed on the major players, he said, including the one who created the problem we're addressing. I didn't create the Abyss Sovereign, Salem said. You created the conditions, he said. Centuries of cultivated fear producing generations of Grimm. Grimm biology accumulated to the density that could absorb and process my power's residual energy. He looked at her with the flat assessment that was his default mode. I crossed into a world that had been prepared for something like the Abyss Sovereign by the specific choices of the person in front of me. Salem was quiet for a moment. That's accurate, she said. RWBY blinked. She had expected deflection. Counter-argument. The specific manipulation that Salem's intelligence suggested she used reflexively, not acknowledgement. You know it's accurate, Jin-Woo said. You've been acknowledging things to yourself for a long time without acknowledging them to anyone else. That's the specific habit of someone who has been alone with their decisions for so long that the decisions have stopped requiring external validation. Salem looked at him. You understand that feeling, she said. I understand the version of it that comes from being the strongest available and therefore the most alone, he said. Yours is longer and more complete. He paused. The Abyss Sovereign. What can you tell me about how it's integrating the Grimm biology? It was not a request. Salem recognized the not a request quality and responded to it the way she responded to things she respected, which was directly. The Grimm biology it's carrying will accelerate its evolution rate, she said. The Grimm network I maintain provides a generational memory. 4 centuries of adaptation to Huntsmen combat, silver eyes, dust frequencies, every threat Remnant has produced. The Abyss Sovereign isn't accessing that network directly, but it absorbed enough active Grimm to carry their encoded experience. It knows the silver eyes, RWBY said. It will learn to compensate, Salem said. She looked at RWBY with the specific attention of someone encountering the silver eyes in proximity for the first time in this cycle. The attention that silver eyes always produced in Salem. The specific recognition of the thing that had ended previous cycles and that she had spent centuries preparing against. How often can you activate them? I'm still learning the limits, RWBY said. Learn faster, Salem said. The Abyss Sovereign will develop a shadow layer specifically designed to mitigate the silver eyes frequency. The longer you give it, the thicker that layer becomes. Then we don't give it time, Jin-Woo said. We move today. Today, Ozpin said, from RWBY's right. His voice had the specific quality of concern that produced precision rather than hesitation. The Abyss Sovereign has been developing for 5 days. We don't know its current capability. We know it retreated from the last engagement, Jin-Woo said, which means it assessed itself as not ready, which means today, before it decides it's ready, is the window. He looked at Salem. Your Grimm intelligence. What's the maximum absorption rate before a Grimm hybrid entity achieves developmental ceiling? Salem processed the question with the focused attention of someone who had been studying Grimm development for 4 centuries, being asked a question that their research was specifically calibrated to answer. At the energy density the Abyss Sovereign is operating on, she said, ceiling at current intake rate is approximately 14 hours. It's been 8 hours since the last contact, Jin-Woo said. The training ground was quiet. 6 hours, Weiss said. We have 6 hours before it decides it's ready, Yang said. 5.5, Jin-Woo said. I want to be in position before it makes the decision. Ruby looked at her team, at Ozpin, at Salem, who was looking at Jin-Woo with an expression that was more complicated than anything Ruby had seen Salem wear in intelligence reports or observer descriptions. The specific expression of someone who was used to being the most capable entity in any room they occupied encountering, for the first time in a very long time, a room where that was not the case. All right, Ruby said. We plan, 5 hours to deployment. Let's start. The plan took 2 hours to build and was built by the specific process of 5 perspectives with incompatible foundational assumptions, finding the load-bearing points they agreed on and constructing from there. Salem's contribution was Grimm biology, the specific knowledge of 4 centuries of observing, shaping, and directing the creatures of darkness. I translated into tactical intelligence about the Abyss Sovereign's structural vulnerabilities. Jin-Woo's contribution was Shadow Army deployment, the specific capability of someone who could raise fallen opponents as soldiers, who could sense the full scope of the engagement zone from a single position, who could move shadow soldiers into positions that living combatants couldn't reach without exposure. Team RWBY's contribution was the thing that neither Salem nor Jin-Woo had in abundance, which was the specific capability of people who fought well together. The practiced coordination of 4 individuals who had been in enough dangerous situations together to have developed the operational trust that turned individual capability into collective capability. Ozpin's contribution was knowing which of the roads into Mountain Glen were still passable, which mattered because the Abyss Sovereign had chosen a lair that his century of managing Beacon had given him detailed knowledge of. The plan was not elegant. None of the best plans were elegant. Elegant plans were plans that had been refined past the point where they could adapt to contact with the actual situation. This plan was built for adaptation, structured enough to provide coordination, loose enough to allow for the specific revisions that contact with an evolving opponent would require. The Shadow Army covers the perimeter, Jin-Woo said, looking at the terrain model Weiss had produced. Not to engage, to contain. If the Abyss Sovereign tries to run, the perimeter prevents it. It won't run, Salem said. Not at developmental ceiling. At ceiling, the drive to continue absorbing overrides the self-preservation calculation. She paused. It will fight until it can't. Then we make sure it can't, Yang said, with the specific simplicity of someone who had reduced a complex tactical problem to its essential component, and found the essential component to be something she was very good at. The primary engagement needs to hit all 3 layers simultaneously, Jin-Woo said. The shadow layer, the Grimm layer, and the developmental core that's coordinating them. Hit any 2 without the 3rd, and it rebuilds from the remaining 1. Silver Eyes hits the shadow layer, Ruby said. Dust penetration hits the Grimm layer, Weiss said. The developmental core, Blake said. What is it? Where is it? Jin-Woo looked at Salem, and Salem looked at the terrain model. In Grimm of Advanced Development, the coordination center is the mask, she said. The white bone structure. It's where the accumulated experience is stored and where the behavioral patterns are managed from. She looked at the Abyss Sovereign's reported position. If its structure follows Grimm developmental architecture, the mask will have incorporated the shadow energy's coordination function as well. The mask is the core, Ruby said. Breaking the mask ends it, Salem confirmed. For a standard Grimm, the Abyss Sovereign may have developed redundancies. It may have, Jin-Woo said. We assume it hasn't, and we account for the possibility that it has. He looked at the team. Final check. Everyone understands their role. Shadow perimeter, Yang said. I'm point. I hit it first, hard, and I draw its attention while the others get into position. Dust penetration, Weiss said. I need 12 seconds of the Abyss Sovereign's attention being on Yang before I have a clean angle on the Grimm layer. Mask approach, Blake said. I need the shadow layer disrupted. Ruby, you give me the window. Silver eyes, Ruby said. I activate on Blake's signal. She looked at Jin-Woo. And you? I'm managing the Shadow Army's perimeter and providing real-time sensory intelligence, he said. If any of the 3 layers survive the combined engagement, I address the remainder. He paused. The shadow soldiers that the Abyss Sovereign consumed are still in its energy signature. I can feel them. If I can get close enough, you can pull them back, Ruby said. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know if that's possible, he said. The absorption may have been complete enough that what I'm reading is residue rather than presence. But you can try, Ruby said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Then we build the plan around the possibility, she said. You get close enough to try. Salem looked at this exchange. At the 17-year-old who had organized a tactical alliance between her faction and Beacon and the Shadow Monarch in 5 days, and who was now running a combat briefing that combined information from all 3 parties into a functional plan. At the specific quality of Ruby Rose that every intelligence report had described as idealistic and that Salem was discovering was something else, something that looked like idealism from the outside because the people who labeled it hadn't fully understood what they were looking at. It was not idealism. It was precision about what mattered. The distinction was small. It was also everything. Mountain Glen at the 4th hour of afternoon had the specific quality of abandoned spaces, the preserved decay of a place that had been designed for human habitation and had stopped being habitable, the architecture of a previous civilization remaining as evidence of what had been there and as cover for what had replaced it. The Abyss Sovereign had chosen the collapsed overpass not for strategic positioning, but for what the rubble provided. Enclosed space, multiple shadow angles, the specific geometry that a developing entity used when it was in the process of becoming rather than the process of fighting. Jin-Woo reached the site's perimeter with the Shadow Army deployed at 800 meters, far enough that the Abyss Sovereign's energy signature wouldn't identify the approach as immediate threat, close enough that the containment perimeter could activate before any escape vector was cleared. He positioned them with the specific efficiency of someone who had deployed shadow armies in terrain significantly worse than collapsed urban infrastructure. Team RWBY came in from the south. Salem, who had agreed to participate and whose agreement had been the most operationally significant component of the plan given her Grimm network intelligence, had deployed from the east, not personally at the engagement point, at a position 300 meters out where her connection to the Grimm network could provide real-time intelligence about the Abyss Sovereign's development status without putting her in direct engagement range. She had agreed to this positioning without argument. Ruby had expected argument. The absence of argument told her something about how seriously Salem was taking the Abyss Sovereign as a threat. The specific seriousness of someone who had assessed the situation and had decided that survival of the current moment required concessions that were uncomfortable. Salem valued her own continued existence. Ruby had been told by every source she had ever consulted about Salem. It was the most consistent thing about her. The Abyss Sovereign was threatening Salem's continued existence, which meant Salem's cooperation was genuine for exactly as long as that threat remained. In position, Blake said, into the comm. In position, Weiss confirmed. Ready, Yang said. Her voice had the specific quality of someone who had been building semblance energy for 4 hours and was ready to express it. Jin-Woo looked at the overpass, at the amber-purple light visible in its depths, the Abyss Sovereign's eyes, open in the darkness, aware of approach in the way of something that had developed enough to maintain continuous environmental monitoring. It knew they were here. He had known it would know. It's aware, he said, into the comm. It's not moving, it's waiting. Why is it waiting? Yang said. Because it's decided, he said. The developmental ceiling. It reached it in the last hour. He looked at the overpass. It's not waiting for a better opportunity. It's waiting to see how we approach. It wants to learn from the engagement, Blake said. Yes, Jin-Woo said. Which means we don't give it time to learn. We go immediately. Everything simultaneously. No sequence that allows it to adapt between phases. Everything at once, RWBY said. Everything at once, he confirmed. On your mark, RWBY said. He looked at the overpass. At the amber-purple eyes watching him from the darkness. At the 11 shadow soldiers it had consumed. The residual frequency of them. The ghost of presence that he could feel inside the Abyss Sovereign's energy signature. The specific loss that this world's darkness had been taking from him since the first day. Mark, he said. Yang went through the overpass's eastern wall. Not through the entrance. Through the wall itself. The impact of Ember Celica at 5 hours of accumulated semblance discharge, hitting reinforced concrete with the specific force of someone who had been waiting to hit something for 5 days and was finally hitting it. The wall didn't stop her. The Abyss Sovereign, which had been watching the entrance for the tactical approach, had not positioned itself for someone to enter through structural material. The first 2 seconds of its attention went to Yang. Weiss was already inside through the southern gap, the dust glyph she had been preparing for 12 seconds since Yang's entry, activating at the precise angle that the 4 days of intelligence gathering had identified as the Grimm layer's minimum density. And the dust penetration hit the shadow layer and disrupted it at the specific frequency Blake had identified in their first engagement. Ice and lightning, the counter frequency to shadow absorption, opening the window. The window was 2 seconds. Blake moved through it. Her specific gift, the shadow semblance, the ability to leave an afterimage of herself and move through the negative space of a combat environment, found the Abyss Sovereign's mask at the engagement's second. Not to strike it directly. She did not have what was needed to strike it directly. She needed RWBY's silver eyes to disrupt the shadow coordination before Blake's gamble shroud could reach the developmental core. Now, Blake said. RWBY's silver eyes opened at close range. The silver light in the collapsed overpass's darkness was not the contained, undirected release of an experienced silver-eyed huntress. RWBY's control had been developing for 2 years, but the proximity and the scale and the specific properties of the Abyss Sovereign's shadow layer produced an activation that exceeded what she had planned for. The light filled the overpass with the specific completeness of a power that had been built to respond to darkness and had found more darkness than it had been aimed at. The Abyss Sovereign screamed. The shadow layer dissolved. Not disrupted, not temporarily opened. Dissolved. The silver eyes at this range and this activation level, exceeding the shadow absorption threshold that the Abyss Sovereign had developed against Jin-Woo's specific power signature. The Grimm layer underneath it was exposed in the specific totality of something that had lost its protection completely. Blake's gamble shroud reached the mask. The impact was the impact of a weapon that had been calibrated specifically for this target, hitting the target at the moment of its maximum vulnerability. The developmental core, the Grimm mask that carried 4 centuries of accumulated experience and 5 days of shadow absorption, struck at the precise point where the intelligence said the coordination function was located. The crack ran through the mask from the impact point to its edge. The Abyss Sovereign's movement stopped. Not the cessation of a retreat, not the pause of something regrouping, the specific stillness of something whose coordination had been disrupted at the architectural level, the specific stillness of a system whose central organizing principle had been compromised. Jin-Woo crossed the engagement space in the time it took the stillness to settle. He put his hand on the Abyss Sovereign. What he was reaching for was not the entity itself, not the architecture that had been building for 5 days, not the Grimm biology or the shadow layer or the developmental core that Blake's strike had cracked. He was reaching for the frequency underneath all of it, the specific frequency of his soldiers, the ghost of presence that he had been feeling since the first day. He found them, not complete. The absorption had changed them, the specific change of something that had been taken and processed and incorporated. But underneath the processing, the residual presence remained. Not enough to restore, enough to release. He released them. They dissolved. Not the Abyss Sovereign's dissolution, not the consuming absorption that had taken them. The Shadow Monarch's specific release, deliberate and complete. The dissolution that returned what he had been carrying to the darkness rather than leaving it in something that had used it against him. He held the moment of their release for exactly as long as it took. Then he stepped back. The Abyss Sovereign, without its shadow coordination, without its developmental core's integrity, without the absorbed soldiers that had been providing the monarch energy that anchored its hybrid structure, began to dissolve in the specific way of Grimm at the end of their existence. The white mask fragmenting first, the dissolution spreading from the crack Blake's strike had opened, the amber-purple eyes going dark as the energy that had sustained them dispersed. It was gone in 40 seconds. The collapsed overpass held the specific quiet of a space where something significant had happened, and the significance was still settling. Yang was on one knee. The impact of the Abyss Sovereign's single counterstrike landed in the first second before the plan's phases had produced the effects they were designed to produce, had been significant enough to have taken her off her feet. She was already getting up. She would be fine. She was Yang, and Yang was always fine. But the getting up took a moment. Weiss had a cut above her left eye from debris. Minor, adrenaline managed. The kind of injury that registered as significant after the fighting stopped rather than during. Blake was checking her combat senses against the engagement space with the systematic thoroughness of someone who wanted confirmation before declaring the space clear. RWBY was looking at the place where the Abyss Sovereign had been, at the dispersed fragments of its dissolution, at the specific nothing where it had been. Jin-Woo, she said. He was still standing at the engagement center, in the position he had been when he released the shadow soldiers. It's done, she said. He looked at the space where the Abyss Sovereign had been. Yes, he said. The soldiers, she said. Did you? I released them, he said. What was left of them? They're not in the Abyss Sovereign anymore. He paused. They're not in the shadow either. They're gone. RWBY held this, the specific weight of it, the people he had carried, and released not into his shadow but into the actual finality that they had been waiting for since his raising of them. Gone in the way of things that had been, rather than the absorbed way of things that had been taken. Is that? She started. It's what it is, he said. She looked at him. At the face of someone who had lost something again, and who was managing the loss the way he managed everything, with the flat professional control of someone who had developed the functional relationship with loss that the longevity of their losses required. You can grieve, she said. You don't have to manage it right now. He looked at her. The portals, Weiss said, from the engagement space's edge. RWBY. RWBY turned. The sky above Mountain Glen was doing something that it had not been doing 4 minutes ago. The specific visual distortion of dimensional boundaries under stress, multiple points simultaneously, the shimmer of something pressing against the fabric of reality from multiple directions. Not one rift, not two. A dozen points across the visible sky, each one the specific shimmer of a boundary that had been stressed by the same mechanism that had produced Jin-Woo's crossing. The Abyss Sovereign's dissolution had released what it had been containing. The absorbed energy, shadow soldiers, grim biology, 5 days of accumulated darkness from 2 worlds, dispersed into the dimensional boundary and pushed against it from the inside in the specific way of energy that had been concentrated finding the paths of least resistance. On the paths of least resistance were the existing weaknesses in the dimensional fabric. The weaknesses had been created by Jin-Woo's original crossing. The rifts, Blake said. The crossing damaged the boundary. The Abyss Sovereign's dissolution is pushing through the damage. How many? Yang said. 12 visible, Weiss said. The energy dispersion is still ongoing. More will open. Jin-Woo was looking at the rifts with the specific expression of someone recognizing a pattern they had encountered before. Those lead somewhere, he said. Where? Ruby said. Every rift leads somewhere, he said. Every dimensional boundary is a boundary between two specific locations. The crossings my original rift created. The boundary damage is in the shape of my crossing, which means the rifts that open from it lead along the same dimensional fault lines. Different worlds, Blake said. Yes, Jin-Woo said. Different worlds that were adjacent to the fault line my crossing created. He looked at the 12 rifts in the sky above Mountain Glen. Each one leads to a different reality. And the Abyss Sovereign's energy is dispersing through all of them, Weiss said. Ruby looked at the rifts. At the 12 shimmer points in the sky above a collapsed city in a world that had been at war with darkness since before she was born. Each one a doorway to somewhere that was about to receive the dispersed energy of something that had been born from the collision of two worlds' darknesses. Is it over? She said. Jin-Woo looked at the sky, at the 12 rifts and the dispersing energy and the dimensional fault lines that ran from Remnant to every world that had been adjacent to his crossing. No, he said, this was just the beginning. The sky held the 12 rifts with the patient iridescence of dimensional boundaries under stress. Each one a shimmer, each one a door, each one a world that didn't know yet that something was coming through the damage that had been done to the fabric between realities. Ruby looked at Jin-Woo, at the face of someone who had come through one rift and had been the catalyst for 12 more, at the specific expression of someone who was looking at a problem that was larger than the problem they had solved and who was deciding, in the specific way that he decided things, whether the decision to address it was already made or whether it still required making. She knew the answer before he said it. She had known since the plaza, since the shadow soldiers that had protected civilians without being told to, since the moment she had understood what it meant that his first question had been about whether the civilians were safe. I'm staying, he said. Ruby looked at him. I know, she said. He looked at her. How? He said. She almost smiled. Because the portals opened and you didn't walk toward them, she said. You looked at the ones in the sky. He was quiet for a moment. You notice things, he said. I notice things, she confirmed. Above them, the 12 rifts held their shimmer, patient, iridescent, of the openings that connected Remnant to 12 worlds that were about to receive something that would change them in ways that none of those worlds had planned for. The same way Remnant had received Jin-Woo. The same way Jin-Woo had changed Remnant. We're going to need to close them, Blake said. Yes, Jin-Woo said. And before we can close them, Weiss said. We need to know what's already gone through them, he said. Teams, Yang said. We're going to need teams. We're going to need more than teams, Ruby said. She looked at the rifts, at the 12 worlds that were about to become part of a problem that had started with one man's crossing. We're going to need to be ready for whatever comes back through them. At the site of Salem's observation position, the ancient Queen of Darkness was looking at the same rifts with the specific expression of someone encountering a development that had not been in their calculation and that required immediate reassessment. She had come to this engagement with a specific objective of managing a threat to her operation and had watched that objective achieved in the space of 4 minutes. She had not come expecting 12 doorways to 12 worlds. She looked at the Shadow Monarch, visible at the engagement site's center, looking at the same rifts with the expression of someone who had already made the decision that the situation's next phase required. She had spent 4 centuries managing Remnant. She had spent 5 days managing Sung Jin-Woo. He was already thinking past the end of the problem she had come to solve. She had expected to betray him when the Abyss Sovereign was gone. She had not expected to discover, in the 40 seconds of its dissolution, that she was genuinely curious about what he was going to do next. The betrayal could wait. She was curious. She had not been genuinely curious about anything in a very long time. She looked at the 12 rifts, at the 12 worlds, at the beginning that the ending had produced. And she decided, without anyone asking her and without any strategic framework that she could clearly articulate, to wait and see.